He was born into one of the most famous names in history, but the strange part is you almost never see him. It's as if someone who should have been everywhere chose to disappear completely. But the real question is not where he is. It's why someone born inside global fame would choose to step out of it entirely. And the answer doesn't start with fame. It starts with a moment the world still talks about, but never really understood. There are people who are born into fame, and then there are people who are built inside it. He belongs to the second kind, a name connected to one of the most powerful legacies in music history, but a presence the world barely understands. Not because he is unknown, but because he is intentionally unobserved. He exists in the shadow of a story the world already thinks it knows. A story of fame, controversy, and a legacy too large for one family to carry alone. But somewhere inside that legacy, there is a quieter thread. A figure who didn't step forward when the world expected him to. And over time, that silence became its own kind of identity. Not absence, but distance. And distance, in a world like his, is never accidental. It happened in Berlin, outside a hotel packed with fans, flashing cameras, and restless noise. The air wasn't calm, it was charged. Every movement was watched. Every second was being recorded. Above the crowd, on a balcony high above the street, a father stood holding his infant son. To him, it was not a performance. It was a moment of love, a gesture meant to share joy with people who had followed his life for years. But below him, the world saw something different. A child suspended above chaos, a figure exposed to risk, a moment that felt uncontrolled, uncertain, even dangerous. And in seconds, perception took over reality. What was intended as connection was interpreted as carelessness. What was meant as love was reframed as danger. The same moment, two completely different truths. And once the image entered the world, only one version survived in public memory. Not the intention, but the perception. Neverland was never just a place. To the outside world, it looked like something out of a dream. Rolling green hills, private amusement park, a train that moved slowly through endless property like time didn't matter there. Music in the air, laughter in wide-open spaces. A world designed to feel like childhood itself had been rebuilt from imagination. But that was only the surface. From a distance, Neverland looked free. A place where children could escape pressure, where fame stopped at the gates, where life felt soft, protected, almost unreal. Everything was designed to feel safe. Everything was designed to feel beautiful. And for a while it worked, because on the surface it looked like a childhood no one else in the world could access. But beneath that surface, the reality was quieter. Controlled routines, limited exposure to the outside world, carefully managed interactions. A life shaped more by protection than spontaneity. There were no normal childhood rhythms. No school hall chaos. No casual neighborhood friendships. No unnoticed freedom. Even the joy inside Neverland existed inside boundaries. Not visible ones, but invisible ones. For the children growing up there, life wasn't chaotic. It was structured, not harshly, not cruelly, but intentionally contained. The outside world was something they observed, not something they lived inside. And over time, that shaped something subtle but permanent. A sense that life was divided into two spaces, inside the gates and everything beyond them. And the longer they stayed inside, the wider that separation became. Neverland wasn't just protection. It was conditioning, a place where childhood was preserved, but also carefully shaped. And for the youngest child especially, it became the only reality he understood. Not because he was trapped, but because he had never been anywhere else. It happened without warning. No build-up the public could see. No signal that the world was about to shift. Just a moment, and then everything changed. Inside a home in Los Angeles, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Movement in the halls, sudden urgency in voices, doors opening and closing too fast to understand. Something was wrong. First, it was unclear. Then it became undeniable. Michael Jackson had collapsed. And in that moment, time didn't move forward normally anymore. Fractured. For his children, there was no explanation that could make sense of it. Only fragments, running footsteps, tense faces, a silence that felt too heavy to be normal. Children don't process tragedy in full sentences. They process it in feelings, confusion, fear, stillness, and then the absence of certainty. Something had changed, but no one had told them how permanent it was. Before this moment, there was structure, a father who shaped their world, a home that functioned like protection, a life carefully contained from outside chaos. But in seconds, that structure disappeared. Not gradually, not gently, completely. What remained was not stability. It was uncertainty with no boundaries. And then came something even heavier, the outside world. At first, it was distant, just noise behind walls. But within hours, it became unavoidable. News alerts, breaking headlines, global attention. A private moment had become public property. And grief, something that should have been silent, was suddenly surrounded by cameras, commentary, and interpretation. For the children, this was the second shock. Not just loss, but visibility, because now they were no longer inside protection. They were inside attention. Every movement mattered. Every image spread. Every reaction became part of a global narrative they never agreed to enter. The safety of distance was gone, and in its place was a world watching. This was the real fracture, not just the loss of a father, but the collapse of a system that had kept their world contained. From this moment forward, nothing would feel private again. Not grief, not identity, not life itself. At first, it didn't arrive like a statement. There were no headlines announcing a reinvention, no public speech explaining the change, no dramatic reveal to the world, just a quiet shift, a name that no longer fit the weight it carried. Blanket, a name the world had held on to long after it stopped belonging to him. Then came the adjustment. A new name began to appear in conversation. Bigi, small, simple, almost unremarkable on the surface. But beneath it, the meaning was anything but small. To the outside world, it looked like a nickname change. But internally, it represented something deeper: control over identity, separation from interpretation, a boundary between who he was and what people had decided he should be. It wasn't about rejecting his past. It was about refusing to be defined by it. There was no confrontation behind it, no need to explain, no desire to defend it, no effort to convince the world to understand. Because this wasn't resistance through noise. It was resistance through silence. A decision made without performance. A way of saying, I will exist as myself, not as your version of me. And in that subtle change of name, something larger happened. The identity the world had built around him started to loosen. Not disappear, but lose its control. Because for the first time, he wasn't answering to a legacy. He was quietly stepping outside of it. It didn't happen suddenly. There was no announcement, no clear decision, no moment the world could point to and say, this is when it changed. It happened in silence. Over time, the visibility began to fade. Fewer appearances, fewer public moments, fewer signs of being part of the world that once surrounded his name. Not because something was being avoided loudly, but because something was being stepped away from quietly. The silence didn't feel empty, felt intentional. Where there once would have been responses, explanations, presence, there was now distance. Not resistance, not rejection, just absence of reaction. And in that absence, something new began to form. With less noise outside, something inside began to grow louder. Thoughts that didn't need to be spoken. Ideas that didn't require validation. A private world that didn't depend on being understood. Creativity became internal first. Life became internal first. Identity stopped being something performed and started becoming something experienced privately. And through all of it, one thing remained consistent. There was never an explanation given. No public reasoning. No attempt to translate silence into language for others. Because explanation would have meant reopening the world he was slowly stepping out of. And instead, he chose something simpler. To not explain at all. From the outside, it looked like disappearance. But from the inside, it was reorganization. A life no longer built for visibility, but for internal stability. It didn't begin with a decision. There was no announcement, no turning point the world could witness, no moment that marked a new identity. It began in private. First, it was just observation. Films, scenes, stories unfolding frame by frame, not as entertainment, but as structure. He started noticing how emotion could be shaped without words, how silence in a scene could carry more weight than dialogue, how stories could say what people never directly express. Something inside that language felt familiar, but more importantly, it felt controllable. Over time, watching became understanding. Stories were not just sequences. They were systems of meaning. Every angle mattered. Every pause mattered. Every choice shaped perception. And slowly, a realization formed. Stories could be used to express identity without exposing it directly. That idea stayed. Quietly. There was no stage for it. No audience. Just exploration. Late nights. Rewinding scenes. Breaking down structure. Studying how emotion is built, not spoken. Creativity didn't become a performance. It became internal architecture, a way of thinking, a way of processing, a way of existing without explanation. And through all of it, nothing was shared. No statement, no introduction of a new direction, no attempt to define it for the world. Because this path was not meant to be observed. It was meant to be lived, quietly, without interpretation, without expectation. From the outside, nothing changed. But internally, something was forming that no longer depended on visibility. Not fame, not identity, but creation itself. It wasn't something he stepped into. It was something he inherited. Behind the scenes, the world his father left behind continued to move. An estate, a legacy, a name that still carried global weight. Decisions were being made in rooms he rarely needed to enter, yet still existed in his name. The machinery of fame didn't stop. It simply continued without asking for participation. When involvement was required, it was minimal, measured, selective, not driven by visibility, but by necessity. There were no public statements demanding attention, no attempts to guide perception, no desire to step into the center of it all. Only quiet presence when absolutely required. And even then, without performance. Distance became structure. Not emotional distance alone, but practical distance. A way of staying connected to responsibility without being absorbed by it. He did not reject the legacy. He simply refused to let it define his daily life. So while the world debated ownership, meaning, and control, he remained outside the noise, observing, not orbiting, present, but not absorbed. This was the contradiction he learned to live inside, to be part of something without becoming consumed by it, to acknowledge legacy without surrendering identity to it. And in that balance, a quiet strategy formed. Stay close enough to understand it. Far enough to remain himself. It began with a question. Why does someone born into global fame choose to step away from it? Why would a life built for attention move toward silence instead? That question followed every part of his story. through childhood, through loss, through identity, through distance. But the answer was never simple, and it was never what people assumed, because silence was never absence. It was not disappearance. It was not escape. It was not retreat. It was control. A way to exist without being shaped in real time by the world watching. A way to move without being interpreted at every step. A way to live without turning identity into performance. What looked like stepping away was actually stepping inward. What looked like vanishing was actually choosing boundaries. What looked like absence was actually ownership, not of fame, but of self. And maybe that is where the misunderstanding ends. Because not every story about fame is about chasing it. Some are about surviving it, not by fighting louder, but by speaking less. Until silence is no longer empty, it is intentional. And in his case, it was never about disappearing from the world. It was about refusing to be consumed by it.